The water running out of this rock is older than every animal that has ever lived. Not older than most of them, older than all of them. Somewhere on the order of 1 to 2 billion years sitting in the dark, cut off from the surface since a time when nothing on this planet had a mouth. It's 2.5 kilometers under northern Ontario, inside a working mine, and it isn't a droplet sealed in stone the way you're probably picturing it. It pours out of the fracture at several liters a minute, 10 times saltier than the sea, thick enough that the people who handle it compare it to a light syrup. It comes out clear and turns orange within minutes, as iron that has never touched air finally finds some. And something is alive in it. That was the discovery that made headlines. It's not the one that rattled the people who made it, because in fracture water like this, under South Africa, a geologist looked into a sample and saw something moving. His own account is that it scared the life out of him. Bacteria are not supposed to be visible. He could watch these. They eventually recovered them as deep as 3.6 kilometers down. Animals, with a gut and a nervous system, living in rock where the entire food web was supposed to be single cells. They named the thing after the devil. And if you bring one up here and let it cool to room temperature, the machinery inside its cells stops working. The water comes from Kidd Creek, a working copper, zinc, and silver mine near Timmins, operated by Glencore. It runs past 3,000 meters and is generally described as the deepest base metal mine in the world. Getting from the surface down to the place where the water discharges can take the better part of an hour. None of it was built for science. It was dug for metal, and every discovery in this story happened inside a hole somebody else paid for. The researchers rode along. The researcher is Barbara Sherwood Lawler, a geochemist at the University of Toronto. She first went down Kidd Creek in 1992. Finding this water inside a mine that sprawls for kilometers is less high-tech than you'd assume. You smell it. Ancient fracture water carries a musty edge, and the method is to follow your nose down the tunnel until you reach the rock face it's discharging from. She wanted a sample. She didn't get one for 17 years. The mine had to go deeper first, into rock where the right fractures were finally exposed. In 2009, an expedition took her 2.4 kilometers down, and the team drew off the brine. Then came 4 more years of measurement before anybody would commit to a number in print, because by her own account, her first reaction to the results was that they couldn't possibly be right. The tests came back at a mean age of about 1.6 billion years, with the published range for that fracture system running from 1.1 to 1.7 billion. Samples taken later from around 2.9 kilometers in a separate system returned mean residence times of 1.0 to 2.2 billion. Those numbers are messier than a headline wants them to be, and there's a reason. What's being measured is a mean, an average across a body of water that has been slowly stirring against itself in the dark for an unimaginable stretch. So the defensible way to say it is that this water has been isolated on the order of 1 to 2 billion years, and the samples disagree about where in that window each of them sits. 21 years from her first descent to the published record. So how do you put a date on water? It's 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. No rings, no layers, nothing to count. The usual tools are useless, tritium and carbon. 14 decay far too fast to say anything at all about billion-year timescales. You don't date the water. You date what is piled up inside it. The rock around these fractures contains uranium, thorium, and potassium. As those elements decay, they throw off noble gases, helium-4, neon-21, argon-40, xenon-136. The gases leak into the water and largely stay because crystalline rock has almost no porosity for them to escape through. If you know the production rate, counting the gas gives you a clock. At Kidd Creek, 4 separate noble gas tracers were measured, and all 4 gave the same answer. The researchers are careful about one word here. They say isolated rather than sealed. The lighter gases, helium especially, do diffuse slowly through rock over these timescales, and the models have to account for it. Nothing down there is in a bottle. It's just moving so slowly that a billion years is the relevant unit. So the age of the water is written in radioactive debris. The rock has been shedding into it since a time when the only life on this planet was single-celled. And that matters twice over, because the same debris turns out to be dinner. First, though, a correction, because you've almost certainly seen a version of this story already. Headlines across dozens of sites: the geologist who found the oldest water on Earth and drank it. The taste is real. She's described it as intensely salty and bitter, considerably worse than seawater, and there's a professional reason she can tell you that. Geologists genuinely do put things on their tongues. Salinity is information, and a rough field read of it tells you something useful about how long a brine has been sitting in rock. The drinking is where it falls apart. What she has actually described is tasting: a touch off a finger, and the splash you can't avoid when you stand beside water bubbling out of rock under pressure for hours at a time. Her own published advice on swallowing the stuff is that you would definitely not want to. Read the interviews in order, and what emerges is a field technique rather than a stunt. There's a second wrinkle nobody mentions. The tasting remarks come from interviews around the 2.4-kilometer study, while the oldest dates come from samples taken later at roughly 2.9 kilometers, and xenon ratios show those two depths are fed by hydrogeologically separate systems. The popular version overstates the act, then attaches it to the wrong water. Nobody lied. A vivid detail got compressed and recompressed until a scientist describing a splash on her face became a scientist raising a glass. The real thing is better. Anyway, she follows a smell through a mine until she finds water older than animals. Back to dinner. Almost everything you have ever watched eat runs on sunlight. Plants capture it. Animals consume the plants or consume the things that consumed the plants. Take away the sun and the whole arrangement collapses inside a single season. 2.5 kilometers of rock is an extremely effective way of taking away the sun. The answer is a process called radiolysis, and it deserves to be far better known than it is. The uranium, thorium, and potassium in the surrounding rock decay, throwing off alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. When that radiation strikes a water molecule, it breaks the molecule apart. Split water and you get hydrogen in serious concentrations. You also get oxidants, and those attack the pyrite in the rock to produce sulfate. Hydrogen and sulfate, a fuel and something to burn it with. An entire energy supply manufactured continuously in absolute darkness by nothing more sophisticated than rock decaying next to water, running without a break for as long as the water has been isolated. So is anything using it? The sampling ran through the mid-2000s in the Mponeng gold mine in Gauteng province, South Africa, funded partly by the US Department of Energy and partly by NASA's Astrobiology Institute, which tells you what they were really hoping to learn. The result landed in Science in 2008. Mponeng opened in the late 1980s, and its workings now reach around 4 kilometers below the surface, which makes it the deepest mine on Earth. Published figures for the virgin rock temperature down there sit between 60 and 66 degrees Celsius, depending on where the reading is taken, with humidity often above 95%. Miners descend in cages carrying up to 120 people at a time, then travel a tunnel network roughly 380 kilometers long. To make any of that survivable, the mine pumps something like 6,000 tons of ice slurry underground every day, dragging the air at the working face down to around 30 degrees. Roughly 5,400 tons of rock come out daily, and reporting on the operation puts it at over 1,000 seismic events of some magnitude in the same period. The rock is under enough stress that it fails constantly. That's the laboratory. 2.8 kilometers down inside it, on a level the mine calls 104, the team pulled fracture water and went looking for whatever was living in it. They expected a community. An ecosystem is normally a web, dozens or hundreds of species trading chemistry back and forth. They found one species, not a dominant species with a supporting cast. 1. The first ecosystem ever documented on Earth made of a single organism. The method behind that claim is what makes it hold up. They didn't count organisms under a microscope. They pulled all the DNA out of the water at once and sequenced the lot, a technique called metagenomics, which normally hands you a chaotic soup of hundreds of genomes. Here, more than 99.9% of it came back as a single species, and Chivian's assessment of the remaining sliver was that it was mostly contamination. You can't prove a negative in biology, and something rare could always sit under the detection threshold. But a method designed to find diversity looked as hard as it could and came back with one thing. It's a rod-shaped bacterium. It takes its energy entirely from the hydrogen and sulfate that radiolysis produces. It fixes its own carbon and nitrogen, assembling what it needs from water, inorganic carbon, and ammonia in the rock. It carries a full set of sporulation genes, so it can most likely shut itself down into a spore and wait out conditions it doesn't like. It is independent of photosynthesis at every link in its chain, which no other cataloged ecosystem on this planet can claim. For the name, the researchers reached for Jules Verne. In Journey to the Center of the Earth, published in 1864, Professor Liedenbrock decodes a hidden inscription, conveniently in Latin. Descende, audax viator, et terrestra centrum attingis. Descend, bold traveler, and you will attain the center of the earth. They called it Candidatus de sulphurutis audaxviator, the bold traveler. And for a few years after that, this was understood to be the shape of life underground. Bacteria and archaea, single cells squeezing a living out of rock chemistry, thinning out as you descend. Temperature, oxygen, food, and physical space were all taken to rule out anything more complicated. Nobody was looking for animals down there, because there was no reason to. Then came the samples from the South African mines, and the swirling black shapes Onstad could see with his own eyes. Tullis Onstad, a Princeton geomicrobiologist, had spent 15 years by that point hunting life underground. He had never expected to find something he could watch move. The animals themselves were run down by Gaëtan Bourgoni, a nematode specialist at Ghent University in Belgium. Bourgoni made something like 25 descents into South Africa's gold and platinum mines, going as deep as 2.5 miles. He filtered tens of thousands of liters of hot groundwater out of deep boreholes, with one published figure putting it above 31,000. The hard part wasn't finding worms. It was proving they hadn't come down with the miners. A single nematode riding in on a boot, or in the water the mine pumps down for drilling, makes the entire result worthless. So the team also sampled the soil around the boreholes and filtered roughly 40,000 gallons of surface water to show the animals weren't arriving from above. Then, isotope dated the water the worms were swimming in. In the Beatrix gold mine in Free State Province, 1.3 kilometers down, they found it. Nematodes, and among them a species new to science. They went on to recover or detect them in fracture water at 0.9, 1.3, and 3.6 kilometers. It's about 0.5 millimeter long. It tolerates heat and very low oxygen. Its home water sitting at 37 degrees, alkaline, hypoxic, and thick with methane. It grazes on the mixed community of bacteria living down there, some of which make their living off rock chemistry the way the Emponing bacterium does. And the recovery came down to almost nothing. From all that filtering, a single specimen came up alive. The team kept it in what they've described as a nematode intensive care unit, hoping it would lay before it died, because males aren't necessary for this kind of animal. It produced 8 viable eggs and then died. Every Halocephalobus mephisto studied since, including every one used for the genome work, descends from that one worm and those 8 eggs. The water at those sites dated to several thousand years old, over 6,000 in the published work, with the range across the various boreholes reported at roughly 3 to 12,000 years. Thousands, not billions. This is younger, shallower water than the Ontario brine, and collapsing the two together is the easiest mistake anyone telling this story can make. They named it Halocephalobus mephisto, after Mephistopheles, the devil of the Faust legend. The name means, roughly, he who loves not the light. Per Onstad, the team tried to get the paper titled Worms from Hell. Nature declined. Onstad's line about the scale of it, to live science, it's kind of like finding Moby Dick in Lake Ontario. He put the size gap at 10 billion times the bacteria it feeds on, though he quoted a more conservative million elsewhere that same week, and the point survives either figure. In a world where the entire food web was assumed to be single cells, they had found a predator. Genome work since has settled where it belongs, and it's more specific than anyone expected. A 2019 study in Nature Communications, led by John Brock's lab at American University, sequenced the animal and found 112 copies of the heat shock protein gene HSP70. The standard laboratory roundworm, C. elegans, carries 13. The team also found extra copies of AIG1, a cellular survival gene, apparently picked up at some point by horizontal transfer from a fungus. Brock's reading of it is the useful one. The worm can't run away from heat, so it adapts or it dies, and the duplicated genes are what that adaptation looks like written down. Then, in 2024, the same lab published the complete mitochondrial genome in Communications Biology. The worm's cytochrome C oxidase, the enzyme at the end of the respiratory chain, shuts down almost entirely at 20 degrees Celsius. Cool it to something like a comfortable room, and the proton gradient across its mitochondrial membrane collapses by nearly 5-fold against what it manages at 37 degrees. Its metabolism is tuned to the temperature of a deep aquifer and fails at the temperature of the surface. A worm that fell down a hole recently would not look like this. That leaves the question of how it got down there at all, and the researchers are careful here. Borgoni's account is that the ancestors of these worms probably lived on the surface and worked their way down through fractures over many generations, eating bacteria as they went. Onstott's version of the same idea was that if a worm can keep moving through the cracks and keep picking up food along the way, it doesn't much care how deep it is, and given enough time it gets there. Nobody watched it happen. It's the explanation that requires the fewest miracles. Onstott's summary was blunter than any of that. Nobody in their right mind would think they were down there. He was right, and it kept getting worse. Because once Borgoni knew what to look for, he went back. In 1915, the team published in Nature Communications on 17 animal species found in fracture water in 2 South African gold mines, at depths reaching 1.4 kilometers in water up to 12,300 years old. Flatworms, segmented worms related to earthworms, rotifers, more roundworms, and a copepod, which is a crustacean, a tiny relative of shrimp, and possibly new to science. They filmed biofilms coating the rock faces inside the fractures with an endoscope, the first time anyone had documented them in place. Borgoni's description of it was that it's very crowded in some places down there, a veritable zoo. And Kidd Creek was not a Canadian accident. In 2022, the same group published on Moab Khotsong, a gold and uranium mine about 160 kilometers southwest of Johannesburg. They drilled from 2.896 kilometers below surface and intersected a major fracture zone at 3.213 kilometers. What came out was a calcium-sodium chloride brine at 102 bars and 54 degrees, loaded with hydrogen and methane, with a residence time over 1 billion years, carrying the highest concentrations of radiogenic products ever found in any fluid anywhere. It also contained an excess of krypton-86, a tracer nobody had read this way before. A new instrument for dating deep water, discovered inside the water. 2 continents, a decade apart, in completely different rock. The same thing. And here the numbers stop being about 2 mines. The Precambrian crystalline crust these systems sit inside makes up roughly 72% of the continents by area, and current estimates put the groundwater held in it at somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of the continental total. Those figures are modeled, extrapolated outward from a small handful of sampled sites, so treat them as an order of magnitude rather than a measurement. Even read conservatively, they say the same thing. This was never a freak pocket under Ontario. It's a substantial fraction of all the water beneath every continent, and almost none of it has been looked at. In 2018, after a 10-year global effort involving more than 1,000 scientists, the Deep Carbon Observatory put figures on the whole underground biosphere. They did it by drilling into the seabed and sampling continental mines and boreholes past 5 kilometers, then building a model out of hundreds of sites. That method matters, because everything that follows is an extrapolation rather than a census. The habitable volume came out at 2 to 2.3 billion cubic kilometers, close to twice the volume of all the oceans combined. The living carbon inside it, 15 to 23 billion tons, somewhere between 245 and 385 times the carbon mass of every human on the surface. And their estimate of how much of Earth's bacteria and archaea live underground rather than up here, around 70%. Turn that around and the surface starts to look like the unusual place. The thin sunlit skin we live on, where life burns fast and dies quickly, is the exception. The default condition for life on this planet is dark, slow, packed into rock, and fed by uranium. Tullis Onstadt spent 37 years at Princeton chasing that idea into the deepest holes on the planet. He died in October 2021 at 66 of complications from lung cancer. His bacterium outlived the argument. Desulfurutis audaxviator became the model organism for one specific question. Can anything live somewhere the sun has never reached, at any point ever? Nobody has found life on Europa or Mars, and nothing here says they will. What the work does is change what counts as a reasonable place to look. If radiolysis can run a biosphere under Ontario, then the same chemistry under Europa's ice shell, where an ocean sits against rock in permanent darkness, can no longer be dismissed on energy grounds. The same argument has been run for the Martian subsurface, where cosmic rays could split buried water much the way uranium splits it under Timmins. That's an inference from shared chemistry rather than a discovery, and the researchers making it say so plainly. It isn't an idle connection either. The 2008 work was funded in part by the NASA Astrobiology Institute, and a NASA researcher, Jesse Tarnas, has been down Kidd Creek himself to see what those fluids imply about Mars. So if you want to know whether anything is alive under the ice of Europa, the closest analog anyone has is a wet crack in a Canadian mine. And the possibility that would have sounded ridiculous 15 years ago, the one the last 2 decades have forced onto the table, is that whatever is down there might be bigger than a cell. For a century and a half, A Living World Beneath Our Feet was a novel by Jules Verne. It turned out to be real, mostly microscopic, powered by the slow decay of uranium in absolute darkness. And when they finally caught one of the animals living in it, they named the thing after the devil. There's a lake 240 kilometers long, sealed under nearly 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, and scientists have been arguing about what's swimming in it for exactly this reason. That video is on screen now,